All of these keyboards are Hall effect keyboards, or rapid trigger keyboards, or Wooting clones, whatever you want to call them. Fact is, these are like super hype right now in the gaming keyboard space. Lots of pro players use them, people swear these will make you better in game, some even say it's like cheating compared to a normal keyboard. And yeah, there's definitely some truth to that. We're gonna do a bunch of more objective tests with all of these keyboards in a minute, but I can already tell you, after spending some time with these keyboards, I really don't know if I can ever go back to a normal mechanical keyboard. These really are that good. Of course, there are a few things I don't like about some of the keyboards that I've tested. We'll get to that, but yeah, a good Hall effect keyboard with the right settings just feels so much more responsive in game than every mechanical keyboard I've tested so far. So it's clear to me that I need a Hall effect keyboard for gaming. Question though is, which one? I mean, Wooting made Hall effect keyboards popular, so the 60HE would be the obvious choice. And I have one right here in this super nice Alumaze case, which is Wooting's new aluminum case. But yeah, Wooting are not the only ones anymore who make keyboards like this. There's actually a lot of competition right now, and finally even some well-known brands from the mechanical keyboard space are jumping onto the Hall effect hype train. Here we have the brand new Q1 HE by Keychron. Everglide also brought out a new Hall effect keyboard, and Akko even have a few ones, but this one probably is their most high-end HE keyboard that even has 8 kHz polling, that is 8 times the polling rate of the Wooting 60HE. And I have high expectations for these keyboards, because I've tested a few mechanical keyboards from these brands before, and yeah, they definitely know how to make keyboards. And then there's also the KB65HE by Endgame Gear, and yeah, Endgame Gear makes some really nice gaming mice, so I was excited to check out their keyboard too. All of these have aluminum cases, all of them support rapid trigger, so this is gonna be interesting. Now, the lag or latency is actually the first thing I want to tackle. Safe to say, brands love to claim their gaming peripherals are the fastest on the market, so I actually built a solenoid rig just for the purpose of measuring the real latency of these keyboards. I took some inspiration from Battle Nonsense, shout out to him. It's important to note that we're measuring the entire end-to-end latency here, meaning the time it takes between the first contact with the keycap up until the action shows up on screen. So this is not just the latency of the keyboard, it includes the PC and monitor latency. So, what do the numbers look like? Well, Akko's keyboard comes out on top, which is not really a surprise when you consider it's the only one with an 8 kHz polling rate. Technically, the Everglide AE68 is also advertised with 8 kHz polling, but according to my testing, it's actually 1 kHz. More about that in a minute. Now, Akko's great performance here also comes with a caveat. It only can achieve this with its so-called raw mode turned on. Without it, it's actually the slowest of the bunch. Now you might think, not a big deal, just turn on raw mode then. But this mode only applies to 4 keys max. You can fully choose these 4 keys, and 4 keys obviously are enough to cover WASD, so you can get the fastest latency for all your movement keys. But you're out of luck if you want to use this, let's say, for your weapon slots, crouch, or maybe your build binds in Fortnite, while also having the movement keys covered. Not a big fan of that limitation. Wooting also has a special mode, which they call Tachyon, but this applies to all keys. And even without this mode, the latency is just half a millisecond higher. And Wooting only slightly limit the RGB in their special mode, while Akko's raw mode turns off the RGB entirely. So I much prefer Wooting's implementation. But before getting too hooked up on tiny sub-millisecond latency differences, all these keyboards are actually pretty close when it comes to latency. We're talking about a less than 3 millisecond difference between the fastest and the slowest keyboard on the chart. So realistically, latency is not really a concern with either of these keyboards. I know all this marketing speech about instant reaction times, 0.1mm actuation points and all that can make you think that these Hall effect keyboards are all about reducing the latency of your key presses. But that's really not the case. What really makes these Hall effect keyboards special is not their click latency, but the ability to release and re-trigger keys across the whole keystroke range, aka rapid trigger. That's just completely different from how a mechanical keyboard works. On this Hall effect keyboard, whenever I just lift my finger slightly, the character stops moving, push it back in ever so slightly and the character moves again. That's just super intuitive. A mechanical keyboard just can't do this. Of course, you can still have great movement with a mechanical keyboard, but this rapid trigger mechanic makes a lot of things so much easier. Like counter-strafing, for instance. After switching to Hall effect, my timing has become much more precise. On a mechanical keyboard, I'm much less consistent. And I have this improvement with all 5 of the HE keyboards that I have here. Of course, there are slight differences in how these all feel in game. The switches that these keyboards come with all have slightly different force profiles, and the software and how you can set things up is a bit different too. With the same settings, the Wooting, the Keychron and the Everglide act pretty similar in game and feel kinda similar too. Endgame gears and Akko's keyboard though can act pretty different from the others, depending on the actuation settings you want to run. See, the other keyboards use 3 parameters to control how the key presses and key releases are handled. First, we have the actuation point, which controls at which distance the first key press is detected. This is the setting you want to increase if you fumble a lot, or if resting your fingers on the keycaps already triggers a key. And then there are the press and release sensitivities for rapid trigger. If we set both to, let's say, 0.2 millimeters, releasing the key by that distance resets the key press. Push it down at least 0.2 millimeters again, and it triggers again. That way you can get these really fast inputs. By default, this rapid trigger feature is only active below the actuation point. And that's typically how you want to have it set up. On Akko's keyboard though, rapid trigger is active across the whole keystroke range, even above the actuation point. And that can cause some strange behavior. Like, let's set the actuation point to the deepest setting, and let's keep the rapid trigger stuff at 0.2. Pressing in the keys slightly doesn't do anything now thanks to the deep actuation point. I need to bottom out the switch to engage it. But watch what happens now. I did not completely let go of the key yet, but when I press it back in ever so slightly, it triggers again. That's because activating the key once engages the rapid trigger mode, which then stays active until you completely let go of the key. That's pretty weird. The Wooting 60HE can do this too if you really want. The setting is called Continuous Rapid Trigger. Not sure why you would want this, but point is, you can enable or disable this on Wooting's keyboard, but it's always active on Akko's keyboard. Either you turn off Rapid Trigger entirely, or you get this Continuous Rapid Trigger. And that's a bit of a shame, honestly. I have to admit, it's kinda hard to notice this behavior if you set super short actuation points, but with some settings combinations, this is an issue. Endgame Gear also made, let's say, a bit of an interesting decision. Their keyboard basically doesn't have a setting for the actuation point. The press and release sensitivities, or thresholds as they call it, are the only 2 settings you can configure. Now, first implication is that this also means that the rapid trigger feature is always active, just like on Akko's keyboard. Second thing is, you kinda have to use the press threshold as a makeshift for the actuation point. Meaning, if you want to switch it to trigger at 1 millimeter, you gotta set the press threshold to 1 millimeter. This works, however, this also means that if you let go of the key slightly to reset it, you need to press it another 1 millimeter to trigger it again. This can cause this weird, dead zone in the middle of a keystroke. See, nothing happens here in that range, there's a whole millimeter of dead space now, where the key just doesn't trigger again. That's not something that's super noticeable if you're using very short thresholds, but 100% this is an issue if you want to run something like 1 or 2 millimeter for the press threshold paired with a short release threshold. Now, apart from that, I actually have a lot of sympathy for the KB65HE. After all, it's rather affordable for what it is. It comes in at about 140 bucks and comes with an aluminum case as standard. And it even sounds pretty nice out of the box. But yeah, it's only really a viable option if you're planning to use 0.1 or maybe 0.5 millimeter for the actuation anyway. Otherwise, if you prefer your keyboard to be less sensitive, or if you just don't know yet, the lack of a dedicated actuation point setting is a real deal breaker. Akko's keyboard though, I don't know, it just makes me mad. I absolutely love the build quality. It's this super heavy aluminum case, brass everywhere, it's built like a tank, and the Year of the Dragon design also looks pretty nice. You can clearly see that Akko knows how to build keyboards. Keyboard hardware, that is. Everything else about this keyboard just drives me insane. The software and firmware are super important for Hall of Fame keyboards. There's a lot of stuff to configure, actuation points, all that rapid trigger stuff and whatnot. But Akko's software just is a pain to use. It's super cluttered and confusing, and on top of that, there are bugs and glitches. The profiles you can create don't even work properly. Whatever actuation or rapid trigger settings you set just get applied to all profiles, which makes it impossible to have different profiles for different games, or even a less aggressive profile for typing, which you really need if you're running similar settings to mine. And then there's the firmware side of things. Remember the 8 kHz polling? This is the only keyboard of the bunch that has this feature. Well, kind of. Let's actually talk about the polling rates of all of these keyboards. I ran some tests with Keyboard Inspector, and this is what I found out. The other keyboards all run at 1 kHz, like you would expect. Well, Everglide advertised their AE68 with up to 8 kHz, but apparently it's just 1 kHz too. False advertising, I guess, but at least it does a stable 1 kHz. What gets real interesting though is when we take a look at what Akko's keyboard does. With raw mode turned on, we get 8 kHz, just as advertised. That's great. But remember, the raw mode only applies to 4 keys max. And the other keys, well, they are only polling at 120 Hz when the raw mode is active. That's just ridiculously low. And I thought maybe without the raw mode, the whole keyboard would at least clock at 1 kHz. But no, it runs at 241 Hz, not even 500 Hz. Really, everything besides the hardware is bad about this keyboard. And that's super unfortunate as the hardware really is great. To be fair though, it's not only Akko that are playing catch up with Wooting when it comes to software. The software is actually such a vital part of these Hall effect keyboards. There are so many things to adjust and fine-tune over time, and you want to have different profiles, different actuation points and stuff for gaming and typing. So you're spending a good amount of time with this software. And Wooting and Keychron seem to be the only one that have realized how important the software is. Wooting have this slick web interface that's quite intuitive to use, and most importantly, it has all the features you want, and when you change something, it actually works, which cannot be taken for granted, unfortunately. Keychron really are the only ones that can even compete with Wooting here. Just like Wooting, Keychron have a web interface too, so no need to install something on your PC. It has almost all the features that Wooting have, and it's been just as reliable for me. Only thing, it maybe lacks some polish here and there, like the way you switch between setting the actuation distances and the rapid trigger settings can feel a bit clunky sometimes, but that's nitpicking, especially if you look at what all the others are doing. I mean, Akko is off the cards with their software, and Endgame Gear and Everglide only have these very basic applications, and you gotta install these. Both are kind of stripped down, and there's really not a lot to configure. No dynamic keystroke and no mod tab, but they kind of get the job done for the basic stuff. Both are missing a very vital feature though, and that's the option to change profiles with a keyboard shortcut. See, on the Wooting, I can just hit Fn plus enter to toggle between my gaming and typing profile. And on the Keychron, I have it set up so that my typing profile is on Fn plus 1, my gaming profile is on Fn plus 2. I have my profiles for these keyboards linked down below, by the way. This quick profile switching is actually super convenient, and I use it a lot, because typing on a keyboard that has different actuation points for a lot of keys, and some keys that are configured to be super sensitive, that's really not a great typing experience. On the Endgame Gear keyboard though, you gotta open up the app every time you want to switch profiles. And Everglide's app does have profiles too, but the profiles seem super bugged right now as they just won't save different actuation settings. And that's super unfortunate because the Everglide AE68 is actually a great keyboard and in a lot of ways superior to the Endgame Gear KB65 HE without being a lot more expensive. It actually has better build quality, thicker, higher quality keycaps, and the machining of the aluminum case is nicer too. Not a massive fan of the color, so I hope they're gonna have different colorways in the future, but the surface finish is quite nice. However, the sticker on the bottom of the case somehow fused with the protective cover on my unit, which makes it look a bit scuffed. But apart from that, the build on this is very nice. And yeah, what's probably the biggest plus, you can set fixed actuation points in the software, which avoids all this floating actuation point dead zone issues you can have with the Endgame Gear KB65 HE. And it sounds better. So the AE68 comes in third place for me, closely followed by the KB65 HE. Okay, let's talk about my two favorite keyboards then, the Keychron Q1 HE and the Wooting 60 HE. I have a hard time deciding between these two, as they both have their pros and cons. For one, I find it kinda difficult to adjust to the missing arrow keys of the 60HE. Mod Tab is a great workaround. I have it set up so that the bottom 4 keys act as arrow keys when I short press them, but it's just not the same as real arrow keys, which the Q1 HE does have, as it's a 75% layout. And it's actually not that much wider than the 60HE, and it also has a knob which is quite nice for quick volume control. And it even comes like this, fully built with this nice and super heavy aluminum case and good quality keycaps. And it's $219 US, whereas the 60HE spec, like I have it here with this alumace case and all that, costs roughly $50 more, and you gotta build it yourself. However, I think the Wooting actually sounds the best. The sound of the Q1 HE still comes in second for me. Not a big fan of the stabilizers though. And yeah, there are these little things that kinda give away that Keychron are still quite new to the Hall effect game, and Wooting already have a ton of experience. The 60HE really was plug and play for me, super smooth experience right out of the box, whereas the Q1 HE did have some issues with not registering some inputs. Like, sometimes a key just quit registering when bottoming out the switch. Super annoying, and I think that even got me killed a few times in Valorant. Eventually, I was able to fix this through the calibration procedure in Keychron software, and I gotta give them credit. The procedure is very straightforward and nicely made, with the RGB backlight turning from red to green whenever key is successfully calibrated. But Wooting's keyboard apparently doesn't even need a calibration procedure at all, as it can just calibrate keys on the fly. I didn't have a single faulty input with the 60HE, and not a single key press that didn't register. The Q1 HE though occasionally needs to be recalibrated, which is a bit annoying. That's also true for Everglide's and Akko's keyboard, by the way. Only Wooting and Endgame gear don't need any calibration. So I'd say Keychron is like maybe 90–95% there. It's close to the basically flawless experience I've had with the Wooting 60HE. I still kinda prefer the 75% form factor of the Q1 HE though, so I'm probably gonna be switching back and forth between them, even though the 60HE kinda is the better keyboard. At least until Keychron catches up on the calibration stuff. I'm sure they're gonna continue working on that, but the Wooting 80HE is also on the horizon, so yeah, that's gonna be interesting too. Thanks for watching, bis zum nächsten Video.